Welcome to this third magical day here in Harpa. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and have a chance to discuss such an important topic in the context of Iceland and Greenland, our emerging security concerns. My name is Halla Hrund. I have the honor of moderating this esteemed panel and to engage you into the discussion about this important topic. I am the Director General of Iceland's National Energy Authority and the co-founder of the Arctic initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. The session is organized with the Arctic Center at the University of Iceland in collaboration with multiple parties. But to start with a big picture, I don't think there's a need to convince anyone in this audience that there are growing security concerns in the Arctic in such interdisciplinary and multiple perspective ways. There is a need to focus on environmental security with the melting of the ice. There is a need to think about economic security with increased traffic in the region. There is also a need to think more about cultural security as local communities are experiencing the rapid change that we have discussed here over the last few days. But last and not least, there is a need to look at geopolitics, look at the concerns that we're seeing with the growing international interest in the Arctic, represented amongst others with increased activities of countries like China, Russia, and the US, and collaboration across multiple players in the region. While being small players, Iceland and Greenland are at the center of all of these changes. So looking at how these changes are impacting the local communities in those countries is extremely important. And today, I hope we'll be able to cover many of them and also to discuss the way forward. But to start the dialogue, I'm going to invite Aaja Larsen to the podium. She's a member of the Danish Parliament for Greenland's IA party. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. For all of us who have attended the Arctic Circle the last few days, there's no doubt that the Arctic is an ever more interesting region. The focus on Greenland has certainly increased for the last few years. And with increased interest from the outside comes a higher potential for conflicts in the region. The Arctic is well known for the good collaboration that we have, and our common wishes to have the Arctic still be a low-tension area. And for more than 10 years ago, we signed the Ilulissat Declaration in my home country, Greenland. It's about peace and collaboration in the Arctic region. And together we have kept the promises that we gave to each other at the time. We have kept the commitment for peace in the Arctic region. And however, it shouldn't be the interest from great powers outside of the Arctic that should be finding the path forward for the Arctic. It should be us, the peoples of the Arctic. We have many shared values in the Arctic. We have common goals between Greenland and Denmark, the respect for rule of law, for human rights, and welfare of the people living in the Arctic. Not that long ago, a report pointed out how we can further recommendations on furthering the collaboration between Greenland and Denmark. It was a Greenland committee that was assigned by the Icelandic government. It gave 99 recommendations, and this included thoughts on a free trade between Greenland and Iceland. It was about an Arctic center. It was about collaboration when it comes to the new shipping routes. And there is no doubt that in Greenland, we truly appreciate the good collaboration that we have with Iceland, and we want to see it strengthened. In fact, there was a recent survey done at the Greenlandic University on Foreign Affairs amongst Greenlanders, where the conclusion was that the collaboration with Iceland is something that is truly highly appreciated and something that we would like to see strengthened. And good collaboration when it comes to defense and civil assignments in the Arctic is key. The need for increased international collaboration and the need for knowledge sharing on search and rescue in the Arctic is vital, especially when we think of increased tourism and when we think of even more traffic by sea. In Greenland, we also see the need for increase on activity on what's going on in the airspace around us. And at the same time, we also need to increase capacity and knowledge on foreign affairs. A new contact committee between Greenland, Denmark, and the Faroe Islands has been established recently, and this will increase Greenland's access to confidential knowledge. Greenland will also play a key role when it comes to the Arctic Council on behalf of the Kingdom of Denmark. This is all part of the work that the government back home in Greenland is working for, and it can be summed up by the phrase that you have already heard from this podium: nothing about us without us. We insist on a more equal role within the realm. And on a long-term goal, we need to have even more research on foreign affairs issues back home in Greenland, not only on climate change, but also on security issues, on international politics. We also need to have common international guidelines when it comes to research in the Arctic. And soon there will be a new center at the Greenlandic University focusing on foreign affairs and climate change, a center that we pushed for at the Danish Parliament and that we've been able to get funding for, and I'm really glad for that. And I just want to conclude by saying I have high hopes for the future, high hopes for the collaboration between Greenland and Iceland. Thank you very much for your time. Qoyana.
Thank you so much, Aaja, for sharing those perspectives from Greenland. We're going to continue with representation from Greenland. We're going to hear from Sara Olsvig, who's the former Vice Premier and Minister for Social Affairs, Families, Gender Equality and Justice. She's also a current Ph.D. student at the University of Greenland and is currently as well an assigned member of the Constitutional Commission of Greenland and the co-chair of the Arctic-Circle Mission Council on Greenland in the Arctic. Sara, the podium is yours.
That was a long title. It keeps getting longer and longer, the more years you spend out of politics. As Halla, thank you very much, and as Halla said, I have transferred into academia, or back into academia after having been in politics. I was also a member of the Danish Parliament some years ago, representing IA as well and Greenland. And in those years as member of the Danish Parliament, it was very important for me to be in the committees that work with foreign policy and security issues, security and defense issues, because exactly those areas are the ones. There is a big gray zone on decision-making in between Greenland and Denmark. So in my academic work also, of course, built on the knowledge that I gained working in politics. So we are talking about Greenland and Iceland on this session. And when we talk about security issues, the biggest difference between Greenland and Iceland is that Iceland is a sovereign state. Greenland is not, but Greenland is working towards independence and now also looking at this in an analytic way, not just a political way. That also poses a long list of challenges, both in regards to what to say in these kinds of fora, but also in regards to how the decisions should be made. Because what is the foundation for Greenland today is, of course, the Greenlandic people being recognized as a people pursuant to international law with the right of self-determination. And one point that I continuously make and also now look at as an academic is that this self-determination is not limited to domestic issues. You cannot limit it to domestic issues. So although Greenland is part of a state, the Kingdom of Denmark, and although the state and Denmark are the ones on paper responsible for security and defense issues, Greenland has shown through time that it, by its own agency and by its own actions, is in praxis conducting both foreign policy, security, and defense-related issues and policies. So the challenge is to actually to cope with these gray zones and build a system where you can legitimize the decisions that are made, often in Copenhagen, because they are very much related to the people of Greenland and the people on the ground in the Arctic in general. I thought it was very, very interesting, of course, after the election in Greenland, seeing the new Greenlandic government being quite specific and more specific than we have seen previous governments being on the issue of militarization, on the issue of security in their coalition agreement. I read in the Danish coalition agreement that the Greenland government is actually talking about demilitarization. And you can debate whether wanting less military in the Arctic is a naive thing, or if it's even reachable, if it's realistic or not. But the fact is that the message is that the people of Greenland, with the government of Greenland, is saying that they don't want more militarization of the Arctic. And this is exactly the key issue for a lot of peoples of the Arctic, because we live there, people live there, and nobody likes to see that there's a risk for more tension and more militarization. We have had the experiences as peoples of the Arctic through the Cold War and seen what limitations that gives the life in the Arctic, just in the sense of being in contact with each other, but also in the sense of being able to actually conduct the self-determination that so many peoples fought for so many years. And this brings me to the question of NATO, which is also always a difficult question to debate. But I have a few comments that I want to bring to the table here in the beginning of this debate. And that is that I would urge a Greenlandic government, but also all the other governments of the Arctic, to be very, very careful in debating and deciding what the role of NATO should be in the Arctic. We see a greater role for NATO in the northern part of Norway, but should it be the same in Iceland? Or even more important for Greenland, should it be the same in Greenland? My analysis is that it shouldn't, that you should actually differentiate very clearly for Greenland should differentiate very clearly between a relationship to NATO and a relationship to the US. The long historic relationship to the US is there and it's important, but you have to differentiate between those two. And for NATO also, I think it's very important to differentiate between the North Atlantic and the Arctic. Because if we really want the Arctic to continue to be of low tension and listen to the peoples who do not want more militarization, then the role of NATO in the Arctic must be very carefully considered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara, and particularly for your interesting points on NATO. I look forward to further elaborate on those during our discussions. But we're going to move from Greenland to Iceland. We're going to hear from Egill Níelsson, Senior Advisor with the Icelandic Center for Research. He's also a Ph.D. Fellow at the University of Iceland and the University of Lapland. Egill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Halla. What I will do is sort of pick up on the last point, because when it comes to Iceland, of course, Iceland is a NATO founding member and has built its security on the defense agreement with the US. And we can, of course, see that the increased interest of the in the Arctic from sort of the global community has brought about more military exercises, increased activity, etc. And this is also highlighted in many ways in Iceland's new Arctic policy since May 2021. But the focus is, of course, that there is a full will to keep this as a peaceful zone, that this is a zone of cooperation. And that's a very important message to put out there, although there are, of course, increased exercises and the geopolitical aspects that have been sort of the driving forces, of course, with the annexation of Crimea and then sort of increased US-China tensions have had an immediate impact, of course, on countries like Iceland, which are smaller and are reliant on their cooperation through international bodies such as NATO and then bilateral aspects. What I want to get into here as well is sort of the focus that we have here today on security. If this panel would have been, let's say, at the first Arctic Circle Assembly in 2013, I think it's very likely that economic aspects would have been the focus when it comes to Greenland and Iceland, and sort of this global dimension. And it's also important then to look at the other dimensions of security. And this, of course, includes economic aspects. We can see the direct impacts when there are security issues, for example, with Crimea, when Iceland was exporting around 5% of, total exports from Iceland went to Russia, and they went down to almost zero the year after, mainly seafood products. We can see this also when it comes to scrutiny on foreign direct investments. These are issues that are mainly economical, but have, of course, gotten a stronger security dimension in recent years. And we also see this in other aspects of cooperation, whether it's cultural, sometimes in academic aspects, and when it comes to environmental aspects and climate aspects, which is, of course, then something where cooperation is needed and global challenges won't be solved without that. But I want to make it brief as an opening and leave it to Halla.
Thank you, Egill. We're going to end with a more global perspective. We're going to hear from Marc Lanteigne, Associate Professor of Political Science Department of Social Sciences at the Arctic University of Norway. Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you everyone. As I was sitting before, I suddenly realized that it is been 15 years since my first trip to Iceland to research at the time the specifics of the China-Iceland Free Trade Agreement. And this fits very well into my comments about the question of what I'm looking at in regards to how the Arctic has increasingly become an international concern. That the dividing line between Arctic and non-Arctic issues has become considerably more blurry. And that leads to the question, and there's going to be a lot of questions with this short presentation, about where non-Arctic states fit and how one defines today being an Arctic stakeholder. Now, just over the past few years, many non-Arctic states have begun to express questions about trends in Arctic politics and Arctic security. Much of this debate, and we've heard some comments on this, have centered on China, but that is certainly not the end of the story. We have seen examples of non-Arctic states ranging from the United Kingdom to France to Germany to Japan, and more recently the European Union, who have all come out and said, well, we are very concerned, we are very interested in what is happening in areas of Arctic security, environmental, economic, human security, and in some cases military security. And that leads to the idea of whether or not non-Arctic states can play a role in these emerging areas of dialogue. Now, how to define an Arctic stakeholder is very key here. And this also leads to a debate which is starting to become much more pronounced over whether current Arctic institutions are prepared for the fact that we have more non-Arctic actors beginning to enter the region and to say, I would like to have an opinion, I would like to have a view, I would like to participate in a new policy paper of what is happening in the area of security. To give one brief example, the Arctic Council now has 13 governmental observers. More will very certainly follow. The whole idea of whether non-Arctic states, their security interests can be reconciled with those of the Arctic governments are becoming very important. Other examples I can briefly bring up, the Polar Code, which has been in place now for a few years, the recent fishing ban in the Central Arctic Ocean. Those were crafted with the participation of non-Arctic governments. So where exactly does this leave the debate about how security dialogue is going to be shaping up? And it is very important to note that, as was spoken of, Iceland and Greenland are obviously small states in the Arctic, but they have a very particular role to play. Iceland has begun to brand itself as the gateway to the Arctic, and this has been the case for the last few years, and that includes many non-Arctic states. We have also seen Greenland come to international attention for various reasons just over the past 2 years. So it is very important to note that many Arctic states can very well play a very distinct role in these areas of emerging security dialogue. How to reconcile this will be key. How to decide whether new institutions will need to be crafted, whether or not there needs to be a re-evaluation of existing regimes, all of which will need to be given careful note. So this is what I've been working on as part of my research ever since I first arrived in Reykjavik 15 years ago. The area of security, the area of security concerns has grown considerably since then. And I just want to conclude by saying that it is going to be very key for these types of questions about security to not only include the big states, the great powers, the major players outside, but all major Arctic actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marc, for kind of covering the big picture. Now we're going to enter into a dialogue, and I want to make sure that you all engage into that dialogue. So please think about questions to ask the panelists. I'm going to break the ice by asking the first one and kind of building on your comments on this notion of whether we need new processes. Do we need a new regime? How do we need to think about organizations or processes to respond to these growing security concerns? And maybe, Marc, just throwing it right back at you.
Okay. Well, it is a very good point, because as of now, we do have several institutions which have been created, the ones that I mentioned, that are starting to develop certain areas of security dialogue. Cooperation between coast guards, issues related to regulation of fishing. But the tricky question, and this comes up quite a bit in a lot of dialogue back in Tromsø, is, okay, do we need to start looking at particular regimes, organizations that deal with security? Now, that leads to a lot of questions, like what are the boundaries of the Arctic? What areas of jurisdiction should properly be addressed? And as has been noted many times during this particular conference, security has taken on many forms, ranging from the military to the economic to environmental.
You actually touched a bit on that dimension, how multifaceted the security term is today. If you think about this from an Icelandic perspective, what are some thoughts on whether we need something new in this area?
Yeah, well, if I look at or try to analyze it in Iceland, it has a lot to do with the geopolitical factors in place. And of course, this was very evident, for example, during the visit of former Vice President Mike Pence to Iceland 2 years ago, where there was, for example, an explicit warning to cooperate closer with China, when it comes to aspects such as, well, he mentioned a specific company, but also especially the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, when it comes to sort of the Arctic dimension of that, there are spillover effects on the whole discourse when it comes to the Arctic. The Arctic Council is the predominant body, but it doesn't deal with security issues. There are, however, these side forums and important aspects such as the search and rescue component, which then is more of a safety aspect. But for security issues, of course, there is very much reliance, I guess, on the allies or the sort of partners of Iceland when it comes to being a country without an army.
Thanks, Egill, and thanks for bringing up, allies, because that's actually right towards your point about how we need to think about strategy when it comes to build relationship with different allies. And can you please elaborate in this context on how you think about the differences between Greenland's relationship with NATO on one hand and then with the US on the other hand? You briefly touched up this in your opening remarks. What are you thinking in this context?
Well, Greenland has a long historic relationship to the US. And I think that there's a very positive vibe around the relationship to the US. You can see that in the recent developments and also see it in the wordings that are used, for example, in the latest meeting in the Joint Committee, which happened in Nuuk recently after 7 years of not meeting in the Joint Committee, which used to be a trilateral or is a trilateral forum between the US, Greenland, and Denmark. There was a crisis some years ago, they stopped meeting, now they meet again, and then they speak of this meeting as a new bilateral meeting between Greenland and US directly, in the way that it was presented to media. So there's definitely something going on where Greenland is increasingly recognized as an actor also by the US. But we must remember that there's a historic reason for why the US is in Greenland. The Thule Air Base and the defense agreements from 1941 and 51, where Greenland did not take part in doing these agreements with the US. So it has taken a long struggle for Greenland to find and pave its way to the table and to become a partner, a direct partner to the US. But that actually brings me back also to the way that we have seen historically the Arctic developing. We probably all remember, as Aaja also said, the Ilulissat Declaration from 2008. But it wasn't everybody who were happy that the Arctic 5 met in Ilulissat and did this declaration. Although a lot of the work we do today is based on the principles laid out in the declaration, rules-based, basing on the conventions that we already know, there were some reactions. Everybody probably knows the reaction of Iceland that wanted to be at the table, but there was also another one, which was that the Inuit Circumpolar Council, the year after 2008, did an Inuit sovereignty declaration. And that reminds us that there are different views on what sovereignty is, what the concept means, and that the Arctic especially is a place where people's different views of sovereignty must be given a place. So I think that there's a big task ahead of us for Greenland specifically. An example is still today that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is more or less inaccessible for Greenlandic parliamentarians unless you're a member of the Danish parliament. So if NATO wants to develop its relationship to the Arctic, why then not make sure that the parliamentarians of the peoples of the Arctic are also at the table? And these kind of structural barriers are actually the ones that is making capacity building, knowledge building, for example, in Greenland, difficult. And that is a very, very important matter, as knowledge, as you know, is also power.
That's actually a perfect segue into you, Aaja, as you are a member of the Danish Parliament. So maybe if you can comment on that. And then you also mentioned the Greenland report on kind of how to strengthen the relationship between Iceland and Greenland. So I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on what are the untapped opportunities for Iceland and Greenland to kind of collaborate in this area.
First of all, I just want to say that Greenland we have thought so much to have different rights when it comes to within the realm, to make sure that Greenland, they will be able to make free trade agreement, and it's not something that Denmark needs to have a say about, and so on. So it's really, all the things that we have fought for is something that we need to preserve and that we need to keep fighting in order to have even more rights. I need to say that first of all. And then I also need to say, when we look at NATO and what's going on in NATO, but also the European Union, I think it's important to say that we shouldn't have a spillover when it comes to the Arctic. If we look at Russia, for example, they have different ways of thinking when it comes to the Arctic and when it comes to Crimea. So therefore, I think it's very important that the sanctions that EU has when it comes to Russia is not something that there will be a spillover when it comes to the Arctic. So we need to figure out how do we, go about all of these things, how do we find the balance. And I truly do believe in good collaboration in the Arctic, and I truly do believe that the experience that we have had and in the Arctic is a role model actually for how you can cooperate internationally. Between Greenland and Iceland, I think it's very much people to people. It's very much about economic development. That's very important for the Greenlandic government as well. And also, looking at green energy and looking at green innovation, that's very interesting for Greenland to look at Iceland and, gain from some of the experiences, but also tourism. Mm-hmm. How should we do tourism in Greenland in the future? We have 2 landing strips in Nuuk and Ilulissat. And should it be mass tourism or should it be quality tourism? That's a question that we're asking ourselves at this time. So I think there's a lot that Greenland can gain, and I'm sure that there's so much that Iceland can gain as well.